All right, well, we are in the second week of our sermon series, Grace on the Big Screen. And the idea behind this series is to use stories from our culture, to use the stories that are told through movies to help us understand some of the bigger ideas and the bigger concepts that are found in the Bible. Things like redemption and grace. These are words that we find all over not only the Bible, but in our worship and in our liturgy. We sing about redemption and grace. But as good as it is to hear a sermon on that, sometimes we need a story to remind us and help us understand these big concepts. C.S. Lewis wrote about this very idea in his book Miracles. He wrote this: in the enjoyment of a great myth, or perhaps we'd say a story or a movie, in the enjoyment of a great myth, we come nearest to experiencing as concrete what can otherwise be understood only as an abstraction. The moment we state this principle, we are admittedly back in the world of abstraction. It is only while receiving the myth as a story that you experience this principle correctly. And so as we seek to experience redemption and experience grace, we have before you the movie The Greatest Showman. Now, this movie is a loose adaptation of the life of P.T. Barnum. It's not one-on-one perfect correspondence, but it's got some really close ties as well. And it is a story, a great story of grace and redemption. So I want to show you a clip that's really more of a trailer that's got all the clips, a good summary of the whole movie. Let's watch the video.
Yes, thank you so much, Mr. Jeffries. Thank you. You'll have the money by the end of the day. And I have your attention. You're all dismissed.
Backward. This isn't the life I promised you.
But I have everything I want.
What about the magic? I am putting together a show. And I need a star. They don't understand, but they will.
Tell me, Mr. Barr, does it bother you that everything you're selling is fake?
Do these smiles seem fake? Doesn't matter where they come from, the joy is real.
So you are a philanthropist.
Well, hyperbole isn't the worst, right?
May I ask you something, Mr. Warner? Why me?
People come to my show for the pleasure of being hoodwinked. Just once I'd love to give them something real.
You don't need everyone to love you, Finn. Just a few good people.
I wanted to be more than I was.
I never wanted anything but the man I fell in love with.
Philip, have you no shame?
The world is changing. Why do you care what they think?
People will come from all over the world, and when they see him, they won't laugh. They'll salute.
The world is ashamed of us. But you put us in the spotlight. You gave us a real family.
Putting folks of all kinds on stage with you, all colors, shapes, sizes. advertises, presenting them as equals. Another critic might have even called it a celebration of humanity.
So that's the movie in brief. To explain some of those scenes, if you've never seen it, the movie begins with P.T. Barnum as a very young boy who never had enough food or money. His father dies when he's very young, and he has to learn to survive by himself on the streets. So there's this scene, and you saw it in the clips, that shows him trying to steal bread, and he's unable to do that, and he's laying there by the side of this building, and he's hungry, starving. And this girl offers him an apple. And her face is a bit mutated and different than most other faces. But she offers him an apple. And what I would argue is that in this moment of offering him an apple, he's able to see her as a person, not as a freak like the rest of the world might have called her in that day, but he sees her as a person. And this then sets the foundation for the whole rest of the movie. P.T. Barnum is this larger-than-life, amazing character, and he's big and fun and creative and does all sorts of things that no one else would think of. He begins this venture called Barnum's American Museum, and this is the real picture of it that you're seeing. And what he offered initially at this museum was just wax figures and silly things. Like there's a picture, if you go looking on Google or Wikipedia, you can see it. It's called the Fiji mermaid. It's got a fish glued to a monkey's head. And they called it a mermaid, and it's not very believable, but people must have thought it looked like a real mermaid. And so he's got all of this fake stuff. And he decides, though, this isn't working, and his girls, I love this in the movie, they say, "Daddy, your museum has too much dead stuff." And so he goes looking for alive stuff, and there he finds this idea of putting in unique people and curiosities. So he starts with Charles Sherwood Stratton, better known as Tom Thumb. There he is, the real picture of what Charles Stratton looked like. I decided to show you the real pictures, or the pictures of the real people, as a way to honor them as people. So he also recruited Annie Jones, the bearded lady, and Fedor Jeftichu, the dog-faced boy, and then there were many, many others. And as he collects all of these acrobats and all sorts of performers, suddenly his museum finds great success. And so here's a picture of the whole cast and the whole group of characters that they've got together. And they're all doing really well, but it's not enough for Barnum. And this is a theme that really works its way through the movie as well, not enough. He continues to find ways to expand to greater and greater circles of people. And for Barnum, this desire is not just for fame, but for respect and for real acceptance within the upper echelons of New York society. And in this, he reminds me a bit of Saul that we talked about last week. Saul, the crusader of the church before he became Paul, was out there persecuting the church. And in his own autobiographies that we find in Galatians and Philippians, he says how much he wanted status and power, how he was a Hebrew of Hebrews, a Benjamin of Benjamins, and of the Benjamite clan, and how much he wanted that power and that fame and that status, but that it wasn't enough for him. There was never enough churches that he could destroy. There was not enough ways to get that power and fame. And then he, of course, and we know this well, he literally sees the light, right? He has this deep encounter with Jesus. And I don't know, as we go back to Barnum, I don't know what his religious life was like. Wikipedia didn't have that sort of information for me. And the movie makes no reference of his religion. But I think the movie has what you might call a come to Jesus moment. A moment where everything seems broken, where you're longing for hope, but you realize you can't get it on your own. You see, that's when we need redemption. That's when we need God's grace, when we realize that our own human strivings aren't enough. That's when we need Jesus the most. And so Barnum finds himself with his museum burned to the ground, his marriage in trouble. He's on the edge of bankruptcy, or he's already there, financially bankrupt. All his glory fades. He's in the bar trying to drown his sorrows, and General Tom Thumb, or Charles Stratton, comes up to him and says, essentially, you need to stop feeling sorry for yourself. And then Barnum begins to sing this song. From Now On is the name of the song. And he says, when the glitter fades and the walls won't hold, from the rubble only one remains. If all was lost, it's more I gain because it led me back to you. There's power in that song, a great sense of redemption, that when everything else in our lives is destroyed, when we feel like it's all broken and everything is hopeless, that's when we need God the most. Of course, I told you all story is just a fragment of the real story, and so in this fragment of the story, Barnum decides and realizes that his family is what he needs more than fame and wealth and glory. And that's so true, isn't it? That our family is there when nothing else is. But if we were to push and help him to know even more about God, we'd help him to know that it's not just family that's good. We need our family, certainly, but that we also need that redemptive love of Christ. So the fragment is there, but there's a lot that we can learn from this fragment of God's story that we have. And that is that God has created each one of us to be beautiful. That God's love is in each one of us. That God has given each one of us a divine reflection of who he is. And so we need that. And the verse that kept coming to my mind, that continued to be present for me as I watched this movie, is this one from Romans 12:2. Do not conform to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. That phrase, do not conform, stood out to me so powerfully. If there was one person that didn't conform, it was P.T. Barnum. Never content to do things in a normal or an average way, his creative mind saw things no one else could see. And more importantly, in New York in the early 1900s, he wasn't content to conform to the patterns of what was right and wrong about society, who fit in and who didn't. The ones that others called freaks, he put in the spotlight. The real bearded lady, the bearded lady in the movie says, our own mothers were ashamed of us, but you gave us a family. And that was true in real life as well. The real bearded lady was sold to the circus when she was just 9 months old. And so we see that there was this sense in society that we need to get rid of these people that look different, these people that don't fit in. And Barnum, though his motives might not have been quite perfect or pure, at least helped to form a community and a family for these people that didn't fit in anywhere else. And I think as we read Romans 12 that this is what we're seeing in part as well. Paul is telling the church in Rome that they cannot conform to the patterns of this world. One of the patterns, of course, is this pattern of wealth and status. Another pattern is holding on too tightly to the traditions of the past. And another one is thinking that we need to go to war all the time. This whole of Romans chapter 12 is really a call to get along and to be peaceable and to love one another deeply. Don't conform to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds. So Romans 12 is a long list. After we get out of do not conform, then there's this list. And I wrote a Sunday school lesson for some of our Sunday school classes, and I said in it, the rest of Romans 12, as you read this list, for me, feels like a best of album. You know those compilation albums you can buy of your favorite artist that's got the best of all their songs in it? This, for me, Romans 12 reads sort of like Paul's best of album. It's got a little of 1 Corinthians 12 with the gifts of and the gifts of the Spirit. It's got a little bit of some of the other lists about what you should do, and it's got some of the lists of what you shouldn't do. It's all right there, packed in one chapter. And so I want to lift up just 3 quick ideas for you of categories that you might use as you look at this list and decide how we are called to live. And the first is hospitality. Paul says, let your love be genuine. And this came out as a strong, strong theme in the movie. Barnum's love for those who were different was not always genuine. But it became genuine by the end. And again, we hear that quote that you heard in the trailer that I showed you in the clip. There are people of all sizes, shapes, and colors on stage as equals. The critic says you might call it a celebration of humanity. People who were accepted nowhere else found a family. And as I watched it, I thought, shouldn't the church be family like this too? We need to let our love be genuine. And when it isn't, others almost always know. And then their trust is gone. So we need to be real and true. Let our love be genuine or sincere, as the slide says. We need to be true in what we believe. A second theme that I think you see both in Romans 12 and the movie is to pursue justice. Hate what is evil, Paul tells the Romans. Do not become overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. The baptismal liturgy that we just did, you heard it, it says, will you accept the grace that God gives you to resist evil and injustice and oppression in whatever forms they present themselves? This is a high calling, a difficult calling. To say no to the patterns of this world, to resist evil and injustice, and to instead love others in a genuine way. We're called not to judge, but we're called to do more than just refrain from judging. We're called to do something about the injustice that exists. And so we saw Pastor Don helping us to think about this in the article that he wrote in The Connection. And if you tried to read that and you thought, wow, my eyes aren't that good anymore, there's bigger copies in the back that have larger print. But the idea there was that there is injustice being done to children at the border. And that's something that's deeply painful to us as we watch those stories. And there are lots of other examples of injustice in the world. Probably if I polled you, you've all got something that burdens your heart. And I think that's the Holy Spirit at work speaking to us when we feel those burdens. And I know some of these things, as we talk about them in the front of the church, seem political, and that scares us. So I don't want to say you need to be a Democrat or you need to be a Republican or you need to wear a certain label. I don't know that God cares about those things. What I do think God cares about is that we love God's people, that we work to fight evil and injustice in whatever forms they present themselves. And I'll say one more thing, that our denomination is there teetering, trying to figure out some pretty big questions, teetering on the brink of schism. And as we wrestle with these issues, I want to remind us that we are called not to hate, never ever to demean others. Hate is evil. We wrestle with those issues and those topics close to our heart. We try to find ways to be faithful, but never, never hate. So this then leads to the third thing. We had hospitality and justice. The third thing I want to talk about is pride. Sometimes the things that are evil come from outside systems, and we need to work hard to resist those systems. Sometimes they come from within ourselves. And again, I saw this in the text and in the movie. Paul says, don't think of yourself as more highly than you ought. And later, don't claim to be wiser than you are. Barnum certainly thought of himself as more highly than anyone else. He claimed that title of the Greatest Showman. And it was, I think, what allowed him to rise to such fame, but it was also his downfall. Pride is what kept high society from accepting Barnum and his friends. The upper class thought that they were too good to associate with people they considered low. Pride is an evil that exists within us. The others that the Catholic Church named for us are greed, slothfulness, lust, anger, envy, gluttony. And there are probably many others that we could list on those things that call us away from God. This is tricky stuff. You see, we're called to celebrate our diversity and appreciate who we are that God made us to be. But we need to be careful to watch for the sins that keep us from God and others. And so I was struggling with this balance and trying to figure out exactly how I wanted to say this, that I want to appreciate diversity, but have us be aware that not everything in me is great. It's good that I have brown hair or whatever, but it's not good if I'm just lazy, right? So we need to find a balance. And Dimitri actually helped me figure this out. He said, I think what you're saying is that it's okay to be an outcast, but it's not okay to cast out God, right? It's okay if the world calls you an outcast. God doesn't see you that way, but it's never okay to cast God out of our lives or our hearts. So there is much more that could be said. So many patterns of this world that trap us into thinking that we're not God's beloved children, but we are. We are God's beloved. God calls us and loves us and reminds us to not be conformed to the patterns of this world, but to be transformed by the renewing of our mind. That word transformed in Greek is metamorphos, and is where we get the science term metamorphosis, right? So from caterpillars into butterflies, we are called to leave behind the patterns of this world and live as God's called people. So I pray that you would hear this call to be transformed. And then this, as far as it depends upon you, live at peace with everyone. Amen. Gracious God,